New York City, September 1954. The subway grate on Lexington Avenue at 52nd Street. Past midnight, but the crowd had only grown larger, pressed against the barricades like they were waiting for something sacred to happen. Marilyn Monroe stood above that grate in a white dress, and every time the wind machine roared to life beneath her feet, the fabric lifted, and 5,000 people screamed. Billy Wilder kept calling for another take, then another. The cameras rolled, the dress flew, and somewhere in that crowd Joe DiMaggio watched his wife become public property. He didn't say a word to anyone. Not yet. But everyone who saw his face that night knew something had broken. What I'm going to tell you today isn't about what the cameras captured. It's about what happened when they stopped rolling. Before we go on, make sure to subscribe, because the stories that matter most are the ones that never made it into the official version. This is one of them. The scene itself was simple enough. Marilyn standing over a subway grate, the warm air pushing her skirt upward, her hands trying to hold it down, while her face registered delight and embarrassment. Innocent, playful, the kind of moment that would define her forever. But by the 15th take, something had shifted in the air. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were shouting things, specific things, the kind of things men yell when they think a woman can't hear them, or when they think she's there for exactly that reason. Wilder didn't stop them. He could have. He had assistants. He had police on the scene. He had the power to clear the block if he wanted to. But he didn't. He kept the cameras running. He kept calling for retakes. The dress kept flying. The crowd kept roaring. And Marilyn kept smiling, because that's what the scene required. She was a professional. She knew how to separate herself from the moment. But Joe DiMaggio wasn't a professional actor. He was a man watching his wife be consumed in public, and he wasn't built for that kind of patience. When Wilder finally called cut for the night, Marilyn walked off the set with her robe pulled tight around her shoulders. Her makeup was still perfect. Her hair was still in place, but her hands were shaking. She didn't look at Joe as she passed him. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of his silence from 20 feet away. He followed her to the car without speaking. The ride back to the hotel was worse than any argument they'd ever had. At least in an argument, something gets said. This was just air, thick and suffocating. The next morning, they were scheduled to shoot the interior scenes at the studio. Controlled environment, closed set. Just the crew, the actors, and a few executives who had flown in from Los Angeles to see how their investment was doing. Marilyn arrived early, which she almost never did. She sat in her dressing room with the door closed, running her lines even though she already knew them. She was trying to find the version of herself that could walk onto that set and pretend the night before hadn't happened. Joe didn't come to the set that day. He stayed at the hotel. And when someone asked Marilyn where he was, she said he wasn't feeling well. No one believed her, but no one pushed. That kind of tension had a smell to it, and everyone recognized it. Hollywood marriages didn't last long when the work required this kind of exposure. Everyone knew that. Marilyn knew that. But knowing something and accepting it are two very different things. The interior scenes went smoothly at first. Wilder was in a good mood, pleased with the footage from the night before. He kept talking about how iconic it was going to be, how people would remember this scene for decades. He wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't reading the room. Marilyn was present but distant. She hit her marks. She delivered her lines. But there was something missing, and everyone felt it. She wasn't playing to the camera the way she usually did. She was somewhere else. During a break, one of the producers approached Wilder near the craft services table. His name was Charles Feldman, a man who had built his career on knowing when to push and when to back off. He didn't look happy. He asked Wilder if he'd heard about the incident at the hotel that morning. Wilder hadn't. Feldman told him that Joe DiMaggio had checked out. Left for Los Angeles on the first flight. Didn't leave a note, didn't say goodbye. Just gone. Wilder's face didn't change much. He, stirring his coffee, nodded slowly, and then said something that would stay with the crew for years. He said, "Well, at least we got the shot." Not a question, not sympathy, just a statement of professional satisfaction. Feldman stared at him for a moment, then walked away without another word. It wasn't the kind of thing you argued about. It was the kind of thing you filed away. The kind of detail that recontextualizes everything you thought you knew about someone. Marilyn heard about what Wilder said, not from Feldman, not from Wilder himself, but from Paula Strasberg, her acting coach, who had been standing close enough to catch it. Paula debated whether to tell her, but ultimately decided that Marilyn deserved to know what kind of people she was working with. She told her quietly, between setups, in a voice so low that no one else could hear. Marilyn's face didn't move. She didn't blink. She just absorbed it, the way she absorbed everything, and then went back to work. The next scene they shot was one of the key emotional moments of the film. Marilyn's character was supposed to be vulnerable, uncertain, caught between desire and propriety. It required a kind of openness that most actors couldn't access on command. But Marilyn wasn't most actors. When Wilder called action, she stepped into the frame and became someone else entirely. The vulnerability was there, but it wasn't the character's vulnerability. It was hers, and it was devastating to watch. Wilder knew it immediately. He could feel it through the camera. This was the kind of performance that won awards, that defined careers, that turned actresses into legends. But it was also the kind of performance that came from a place of real pain, and he knew better than to acknowledge that out loud. When he called cut, he didn't say beautiful or perfect the way he usually did. He just said, "We got it, moving on." And Marilyn walked off the set without waiting for notes. She went back to her dressing room and closed the door. No one knocked. Paula stood outside for a while listening, but there was no sound from inside. Eventually, she walked away. The crew reset for the next scene. Wilder went over the shot list with his cinematographer. The day continued the way days on a film set always continue, with professional momentum and carefully managed silence. But something had shifted. Everyone felt it. The way people moved around Marilyn was different now, less familiar, more careful. She had always been treated with a kind of protective condescension, the way you treat someone who seems fragile and needs guidance. But after that day, the condescension was still there, but the protectiveness had faded. It was as if they'd all seen proof that she could survive anything, so they stopped worrying about whether they were asking too much. That night, Marilyn had dinner with her publicist and two friends from New York. They tried to keep the conversation light, tried to avoid mentioning Joe or the subway scene or anything that might touch the wound. But halfway through the meal, one of the friends made a comment about marriage, something offhand and meant to be funny, and Marilyn set down her fork and looked at her with an expression that was neither angry nor sad, just clear. She said, "Marriage is when you realize that the person who promised to protect you is the same person who needs you to be smaller, so they feel bigger." It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a sentence delivered with the same precision she brought to her best line readings. The table went silent. No one knew what to say. Marilyn picked up her fork again and continued eating, and the conversation eventually moved on. But the sentence stayed with them. The rest of the shoot proceeded without major incident. Wilder got the footage he needed. Marilyn delivered the performance the studio wanted. The white dress scene became exactly what everyone predicted it would be. Iconic, endlessly reproduced, the defining image of Marilyn Monroe. But for the people who were there that night on Lexington Avenue, the image always carried a different weight. They knew what it cost. They knew who paid for it. When the film was released in 1955, the reviews praised Marilyn's performance but focused mostly on her physicality, her charm, her ability to be both sexy and innocent at the same time. No one mentioned the depth of what she was doing. No one talked about the restraint, the control, the way she managed to be vulnerable without ever losing herself. That kind of work didn't get recognized back then. It still barely gets recognized now. Marilyn and Joe divorced later that year. The official statement cited conflicting career demands. No one mentioned the subway grate. No one mentioned the way he left without saying goodbye. No one mentioned Wilder's comment about getting the shot. Those details stayed private, locked in the memories of the people who were there and the few people they trusted enough to tell. Years later, after everything that happened, after Marilyn was gone, and the mythology around her had solidified into something both larger and smaller than the truth, Billy Wilder gave an interview where he was asked about the subway scene. He talked about the technical challenges, the crowd control, the magic of that moment. Then the interviewer asked if he had any regrets about how it was handled. Wilder paused. He looked away from the camera, and then he said, "I wish I'd sent the crowd home after the first take." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to an apology, but it was an admission, and coming from Wilder, that meant something. He'd spent his whole career being unsentimentally brilliant, making films that cut through Hollywood's self-importance with precision and wit. But this was different. This was him acknowledging that maybe, just once, he'd prioritized the shot over the person. Maybe he'd let the spectacle override his judgment. Maybe he'd been complicit in something he didn't fully understand until it was too late. The interviewer didn't push. He moved on to the next question. But people who knew Wilder said that moment changed something in him. He never worked the same way again. He became more protective of his actors, more aware of the cost of what he was asking them to do. It didn't redeem what happened that night in New York, but it suggested that even someone as calculating as Wilder could be reached by the weight of his own choices. Marilyn never spoke publicly about the subway scene with any bitterness. When asked about it in interviews, she smiled and said it was fun, that she loved working with Wilder, that the dress was actually sewn with weights in the hem so it wouldn't fly too high. She turned it into a technical detail, a piece of movie magic. She understood that the public didn't want to hear about the complicated parts. They wanted the image, the fantasy, the moment frozen in time, and she gave them that, because that's what she'd been trained to do. But in private, with the few people she trusted, she told a different story. She talked about the cold that night, the way the wind from the subway felt like it was coming from somewhere deep and industrial and inhuman. She talked about the men in the crowd, the way their faces blurred together into one leering mass. She talked about Joe's silence on the drive back, the way it filled the car like something physical. She talked about Wilder's comment, the casual cruelty of it, the way it confirmed what she'd always suspected, that to most of the people she worked with, she wasn't a person. She was a commodity, valuable, yes, but ultimately replaceable. And yet she kept working. She kept showing up. She kept delivering performances that were more complex and more truthful than anyone gave her credit for. She kept fighting for better roles, more control, the kind of respect that other actors took for granted. She didn't always win those fights. In fact, she lost most of them, but she never stopped fighting. And that, more than anything, is what the people who knew her remembered. Not the fragility, not the dependence, the relentless, exhausting effort to be seen as something more than the image. The subway scene lives on in a way that very few moments in cinema do. It's on posters, in museums, recreated in tributes and parodies and homages. It's become divorced from the film it came from, existing now as pure iconography. Most people who recognize the image have never seen the 7-Year Itch. They don't need to. The image is enough. It tells them everything they think they need to know about Marilyn Monroe. But the people who were there that night, who saw what it took to create that moment, who understood the cost of that particular kind of exposure, they carried a different image. They remembered Marilyn walking off the set with her robe pulled tight, her face composed, her hands trembling. They remembered the silence in the car. They remembered Wilder's comment and the way it hung in the air like an accusation no one was willing to make. They remembered that the image everyone fell in love with was built on a foundation of discomfort, compromise, and a kind of violation that no one wanted to name because naming it would have complicated the fantasy. And Hollywood, then as now, didn't have much patience for complicated fantasies. It wanted clean lines, clear narratives, moments that could be sold and resold without asking too many questions about where they came from. Marilyn understood this better than anyone. She'd built her entire career on giving people what they wanted while holding back the parts of herself that couldn't be commodified. It was an exhausting balance, and it took everything from her. But she maintained it with a discipline and intelligence that most people refused to see, because seeing it would have required them to reconsider their assumptions about who she was and what she represented. In the end, the subway scene became exactly what it was always going to become, a symbol. But symbols are tricky things. They can mean whatever you need them to mean. For some people, it represented joy, spontaneity, the playful eroticism of 1950s Hollywood. For others, it represented exploitation, the reduction of a woman to an image, the cost of beauty in an industry that consumed the people it claimed to celebrate. Both readings are true. Both readings are incomplete. The real story, as always, is more complicated and more human than any single interpretation can contain. It's a story about a woman trying to do her job while navigating a system that valued her body more than her talent. It's a story about a marriage ending in real time while cameras rolled. It's a story about a director making a choice he would later question. It's a story about a crowd of men who thought they had permission to be part of something they should have just witnessed. It's all of these things at once. Years after Marilyn died, Paula Strasberg was asked what she remembered most about working with her. Paula thought for a long time before answering. Then she said, her courtesy. Even when people treated her terribly, even when she had every right to walk away or fight back or make a scene, she maintained this extraordinary courtesy. Not because she was weak, because she understood that losing control meant losing power, and she couldn't afford to lose any more power than she'd already given away. It was an elegant way of describing something that couldn't really be described. The specific kind of strength it takes to endure indignity without becoming indignant. The discipline required to protect yourself while still remaining open enough to do the work. The impossible balance between vulnerability and self-preservation that Marilyn had to maintain every single day of her public life. The subway scene was just one moment in a career full of moments that required that same impossible balance. But it was the moment that crystallized something essential about how Hollywood worked and what it demanded from the women it turned into icons. It showed, in the span of a single night, how easily the line between celebration and exploitation could blur, how quickly protection could turn into exposure, how a moment designed to look spontaneous and joyful could be built on foundations of calculation and control. And Marilyn, standing at the center of all of it, holding her dress down with one hand and her composure together with everything else she had, understood exactly what was happening. She wasn't naive. She wasn't passive. She was making choices with the limited options available to her, doing her best to shape a narrative that kept trying to reduce her to nothing more than a pretty girl standing over a subway grate. If you've stayed this long, if this story means something to you, then you understand why these details matter. Subscribe to hear more, because the truth about people like Marilyn isn't found in the images everyone remembers. It's in the moments between the shots, the conversations that didn't make it into the official record, the quiet acts of dignity that went unrecognized until it was too late to matter. The white dress flies. The crowd cheers. The cameras capture a moment that will outlive everyone who was there. But underneath it all, underneath the mythology and the symbolism and the endless reproduction of an image, there was a woman trying to maintain her dignity in a system designed to strip it away. She succeeded more often than she failed, and that, in the end, is the story Hollywood tried to hide, not through conspiracy or malice, but through simple indifference to anything that complicated the fantasy.